Somewhere in a fossil vault, scientists are holding a piece of an 80-foot predator that ruled every ocean on Earth for 20 million years, and it will never, ever get its DNA. Not because the technology isn't good enough yet. Not because the sample is too small. Because the genetic code of Otodus megalodon crossed a line 3.5 million years ago that no laboratory on the planet can walk back across. And yet, somehow, in the last few years, researchers found a way around that wall entirely, and what they pulled out of a handful of fossilized teeth turned out to be stranger and more devastating than any genome could have told them. This is a story of how science learned to interrogate a creature that left behind almost nothing, and what that creature confessed once someone finally knew how to ask. Start with the scale of what we're talking about, because it's easy to say giant shark and let your brain round it down to something manageable. It shouldn't be rounded down. The largest megalodon individuals are estimated at around 80 feet long, close to 24 meters, longer than a city bus, longer than the boats early fossil hunters used to go looking for its teeth. Weight estimates land somewhere near 90 metric tons, which is heavier than a fully loaded semi-truck, heavier than a small passenger jet. Its teeth, the same serrated triangular blades that get sold in beach shops today, could measure more than 7 inches from root to tip, and its territory wasn't a single ocean or a single climate band. Megalodon teeth have turned up on nearly every continent, from equatorial shallows to cold, high-latitude seabeds where, by every rule scientists thought applied to sharks, an animal this size should not have been able to function. For roughly 20 million years, it did not share the top of the food chain with anything. It simply was a top. Then, around 3.5 million years ago, it disappeared. Not gradually faded into legend the way our imagination likes to picture extinct monsters, but genuinely vanished from a fossil record, leaving behind teeth, a scattering of vertebrae, and almost nothing else. And that's the whole problem in a sentence. When an animal has been gone for 3.5 million years and the only durable parts of its body are teeth, you are trying to reconstruct an entire creature, its metabolism, its behavior, its place in an ancient ecosystem, from what is essentially a fingernail clipping. The obvious answer, the answer every paleontologist would want if wanting things were enough, is DNA. Genetic material would settle almost every open question in a single stroke, exactly how Megalodon was related to other sharks, what its physiology looked like, maybe even clues about coloring or growth rate. But ancient DNA is a chemically unstable molecule, even under the best possible preservation conditions, cold, stable, undisturbed, ideally frozen. The bond holding genetic material together break down over time. The realistic outer limit for recovering any usable ancient DNA sits at roughly 1 to 2 million years, and that ceiling comes from exceptional cases like permafrost-preserved mammoth remains, not from anything resembling the tropical and temperate seafloor sediments where megalodon fossils are usually found. Megalodon has been extinct for at least twice that long, likely more. That is not a narrow miss that a better lab technique might someday close. It is a hard boundary. There is no plausible future in which anyone extracts a working megalodon genome, and any video, article, or headline claiming otherwise is not reporting science. It's inventing it. So for nearly 2 centuries, in the absence of anything better, scientists filled the gap with an assumption, and the assumption came from a single decision made in 1843 by a Swiss naturalist working with nothing but a handful of fossil teeth. He compared those teeth to the teeth of the most famous large predator he knew, the great white shark, and, seeing the same broad triangular shape and serrated edge, classified Megalodon in the same genus. It was a reasonable call given what little he had to work with, but that one classification quietly became destiny. If Megalodon was essentially a great white, then the simplest way to imagine it was to take a great white's body, that stocky, torpedo-shaped, counter-shaded hunter everyone already pictured, and scale it up to monstrous size. That image went into textbooks, documentaries, and museum reconstructions, and it sat there, largely unquestioned, for 180 years. The problem is that shared appearance doesn't necessarily mean shared ancestry. Biologists have a specific term for animals that evolve similar features independently because they are solving the same physical problem. It's called convergent evolution, and it is one of the most persistent traps in the study of ancient life. Any large, fast, marine predator is going to need cutting, serrated teeth, and a body build for sustained speed, regardless of what family tree it comes from. 2 unrelated lineages can arrive at strikingly similar solutions the way 2 engineers in different countries might independently invent nearly the same tool. You cannot resolve a question of ancestry by staring at a tooth shape, no matter how carefully you measure it. Lineage is written in genetics, and for Megalodon, genetics was gone. So the real question researchers eventually had to answer was, if you can't get DNA, is there any other way to trace where this animal actually belongs on the shark family tree, and any other way to learn how its body actually worked? The genomic era gave scientists two separate tools that, combined, cracked this open. The first tool didn't require Megalodon DNA at all. It required the DNA of animals alive today. By sequencing the genomes of living shark species and mapping how their lineages diverge from one another over time, researchers could reconstruct a family tree stretching back tens of millions of years, using descendants as a proxy for the ancestors nobody could sample directly. The second tool was subtler, the realization that a fossil tooth isn't just a shape, it's a chemical record. As a tooth mineralizes inside a living animal, it locks and traces signatures, specific ratios of certain atoms, that reflect conditions in the animal's body at the moment the tooth formed. Unlike DNA, these chemical signatures don't fall apart over millions of years. They are bound into the mineral structure itself, stable and readable in fossils recovered from every continent where Megalodon ever swam. Running the genetic side of this work first. When researchers traced the great white shark's ancestry back through its living relatives, they found something that overturned the 1843 assumption completely. The great white didn't descend from Megalodon or anything closely related to it. Its lineage traces back through mako sharks, fast open water hunters, and an intermediate ancestral form that happened to live in the same seas Megalodon dominated. Megalodon, meanwhile, belonged to an entirely separate branch, one stretching back more than 55 million years, on a path that ran parallel to the great white's lineage but never merged with it. When scientists traced both branches back to their last shared ancestor, that split turned out to sit roughly 100 million years before Megalodon even went extinct. In evolutionary terms, that's an enormous gap, wider than the distance separating many animals nobody would ever think to compare. Megalodon and the great white weren't close cousins. They were two unrelated giants that happened to occupy the same ocean at the same time, and independently evolved similar-looking weapons for the same job. Megalodon wasn't a bigger version of a shark we already knew. It was a rival to it. That correction alone would have been worth reporting. But the chemical side of the research went further, and this is where things get genuinely strange. A technique called clumped isotope thermometry lets scientists read the internal body temperature of an animal that died millions of years ago, straight out of its fossilized tooth enamel. The logic behind it is elegant. When a tooth forms, certain heavier atomic variants of carbon and oxygen bond together at a rate that depends directly on temperature. Warmer tissue at the moment of formation means fewer of those heavy variants end up paired together in the mineral structure. Cooler tissue means more of them do. That ratio gets locked in permanently, essentially freezing a temperature reading at the moment the tooth was built. In a 2023 study, researchers applied exactly this technique to fossil Megalodon teeth, and for the first time, there was direct physical evidence, not inference, not comparison to modern sharks, but a real measurement of what Megalodon's body was actually doing while it was alive. The enamel recorded an internal body temperature running about 7 degrees Celsius above the surrounding seawater, which itself averaged around 27 degrees in the environment studied. When the same method was applied to other, unrelated sharks that lived alongside Megalodon, cold-blooded species that simply matched the temperature of the water around them, their teeth told a completely different story. Their internal temperatures tracked the ocean, drifting somewhere in the low to mid-20s. Megalodon didn't drift with the water. It generated and held its own heat, well above ambient ocean temperature, something almost no shark alive today does to that degree. That single finding rewrites how you have to picture this animal moving through the world. A cold-blooded predator is bound to the temperature of the water it's in, drop into colder water, and its muscles slow, its metabolism drags, its whole system idles down. That's exactly why, under the old assumptions, a giant shark shouldn't have been able to thrive in the cold, high-latitude waters where Megalodon teeth kept turning up. But a body that generates its own internal heat carries a kind of portable climate with it. Its muscles stay responsive, its metabolism stays active, and it can push into colder, deeper, higher-latitude water that would shut a cold-blooded competitor down completely. The warm-bloodedness wasn't just a curious biological detail. It directly explained the geographic puzzle the fossil record had been presenting all along. And the two threads, size and internal warmth reinforce each other in a genuinely elegant way once you think about the physics. Heat escapes an animal's body across its surface area, and as an animal gets larger, its surface area shrinks relative to its total volume. A bigger warm-blooded body loses heat far more slowly than a small one. So for Megalodon, growing larger wasn't only about becoming a more powerful hunter, it also made its internal heat cheaper to maintain per unit of body mass. Size supported warmth, and warmth rewarded size, in a loop that could keep reinforcing itself over millions of years. The staggering scale of this animal and its warm-bloodedness weren't two separate curiosities sitting side by side. They very likely grew together, each one enabling the other. There was still one more layer the teeth had left to give up. Where exactly Megalodon sat within the food web of its own time, and what it was actually eating. For that, researchers turned to a different chemical signature, this time based on zinc isotopes. The ratio between heavier and lighter zinc isotopes shifts in a predictable, measurable way each time you move up a level in a food chain. An animal that eats plants carries one signature. The animal that eats that plant eater carries a slightly shifted version, and the predator above that shifts it again. By measuring zinc isotope ratios across fossil teeth from a whole community of ancient marine species, a 2022 study was able to build something like a chemical ladder of an entire prehistoric ecosystem, and then place Megalodon on it. Megalodon didn't just land near the top. It sat a full trophic level above the great whites that shared its waters, indicating a diet built around large marine mammals and, quite possibly, other formidable predators that few animals in that ocean could challenge. For 20 million years, the fossil record shows this arrangement holding remarkably steady, Megalodon feeding at one distinct level, great whites and other predators feeding at a separate level below, with a stable buffer between them. It wasn't that Megalodon and the other apex sharks of the time were locked in constant competition. The ocean was effectively layered, with Megalodon claiming the largest prey that its size, speed, and heat-generating physiology made accessible to it alone. Then something changes in the very youngest fossil samples, the teeth dated closest to Megalodon's actual extinction. The zinc signatures of Megalodon and the great whites, which have stayed cleanly separated for millions of years, begin sliding toward each other. In the final samples before Megalodon disappears from the record entirely, those two signatures nearly converge. Two predators that had spent 20 million years feeding at different levels of the same ocean were, by the end, drawing from the same shrinking pool of prey. Whether that happened because great whites expanded their range and diet, or because Megalodon's usual food sources were collapsing and it had to reach into shallower, smaller prey, the chemistry shows the same outcome either way. The layered system that had kept these two giants from truly competing broke down right before Megalodon vanished. And this is where the warm-bloodedness, which had been the source of Megalodon's dominance for 20 million years, turns into something closer to a liability. A warm-blooded body of that scale is metabolically expensive in a way a cold-blooded shark simply isn't. A cold-blooded predator can slow its metabolism dramatically during lean periods and survive on very little for a long stretch. An animal generating and holding its own body heat at that size doesn't have that option. Its metabolic demands stay high regardless of whether prey is abundant or scarce. Somewhere around the time Megalodon went extinct, the oceans were cooling and reorganizing, and populations of large marine mammals, the exact prey Megalodon's size required, were contracting and shifting range. At almost the same moment, a more metabolically flexible competitor was moving into the same shrinking feeding zone. The trait that had built Megalodon's 20-million-year reign, its ability to generate its own heat and hunt across thermal boundaries nothing else could cross, became a constant, non-negotiable fuel demand it could no longer meet in an ocean that was providing less. Nothing hunted Megalodon into extinction. There's no evidence of some rival predator that finally beat it. The chemistry points instead to something closer to a metabolic bind, a body built for abundance that couldn't scale down when abundance ran out. One last piece of the picture came from something other than chemistry, actual fossilized vertebrae, recovered from sites in Belgium and Denmark, rare enough that complete sets are almost never found. In 2025, a large international research team compared the proportions of these vertebrae against the body shapes of over 160 living shark species, and modeled the physics of what a body that long could actually look like. A great white stocky, bulky body plan, scaled up to 80 feet, generates so much drag that an animal built that way would struggle to move efficiently at all. The math simply didn't work. The only body plan efficient enough to move a creature that size through open ocean was something longer, leaner, and more tapered, proportioned less like an oversized great white and more like a large baleen whale, streamlined, built for sustained cruising across long distances rather than short bursts of ambush speed. The 2 centuries-old image of a bloated, muscular super shark turns out to have been wrong not just in scale but in fundamental shape. The same vertebrae held one more detail, preserved in growth bands layered inside the bone much like rings in a tree trunk. Reading those bands, researchers estimated that Megalodon was born already enormous, somewhere between roughly 3.5 and 4 meters long at birth, likely reaching that size in womb, in a manner consistent with other lamniform sharks where developing embryos consume unfertilized eggs or, in some cases, weaker siblings before birth. A newborn Megalodon, on the day it entered the ocean, was already close to the maximum length of a fully grown adult great white shark today, the same species whose ancestors and whose modern-day competition for shrinking prey likely played a role in Megalodon's extinction millions of years later. So here is where all of this actually leaves us. Megalodon's DNA is gone permanently, and no future technology is going to change that. That part of the story really is closed. But what survived, teeth scattered across every continent, chemical signatures locked into enamel, growth band preserved in a handful of vertebrae, turned out to carry more information than anyone expected a genome-less fossil record could hold. It was enough to overturn 180 years of assumption built on a single 1843 comparison. Enough to show that Megalodon and the great white were not close relatives but rival lineages separated by roughly 100 million years of independent evolution. Enough to prove Megalodon generated its own body heat, hunted at the very top of its ecosystem, was shaped more like a giant cruising whale than a scaled-up great white, and was ultimately undone not by a rival predator but by a metabolic demand it could never turn off in a world that stopped supplying enough to feed it. The animal never left behind a genome for anyone to read. But it left behind enough stone and enough chemistry that, once scientists finally knew how to ask, it told its own story anyway.